Hi, I'm Warren Sprouse. You're on the Bible Forum this third Sunday in May 2021. And terrorism is flaring up in Jerusalem again. JewishNewsSyndicate.com and 2 or 3 other outlets have been writing on this subject from inside, as it were. Are you paying attention to what's happening in Israel? The last record I got was that more than 1,600 rockets have been fired into Israel. News is still telling us 450. They are targeting large population areas, and they're continuing. Why? Well, because we have a political party in power that is more favorable to Hamas than it is to Israel. They're calling it being fair. Fair is when you sit down at a table and try to work out your differences. Of course, that won't work to the advantage of the Arabs, even though they have access to Israel's most holy site, the Temple Mount. And of course, that is the point. But I want to take a minute and go back in time to make a larger point. In doing so, I am convinced that Facebook, YouTube, and somebody else down the road are going to ban this particular video. I may just not post it on either of those platforms to start with. I will post it on my website, thebibleforum.net. I'm sharing what I'm sure people would consider to be an inconvenient truth. But we're also told that you cannot change history. But today we're working our way through both of those things. And apparently you can scream and holler loud enough and or at the right people, and a history lesson will be scrubbed from public view, public ears, public eyes. The story begins about 4,000 years ago, and it begins with God. God called an insignificant man named Abram to leave his home and to travel hundreds of miles with his family, with his flocks, which were large, to a place God would show him. You can read about it in Genesis chapter 12. And the challenge that God presented to Abram was, I will make of you a great nation. Those who bless thee will flourish. Those who curse thee, I will curse. And in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So here we are. Over time, the Jewish nation was founded. Israel, about 2000 BC, God's everlasting covenant with Abraham. A kingdom in exile for 430 years. A wandering kingdom for 40 years. Settled in, prospering where God put them. A territory once dominated by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A kingdom removed by God for their rebellion for a season, about 470 years. Then bringing them back and reestablishing them. It's a story about a nation of people who reclaimed their ancestral land, the land God gave them, and ruled it for the next 500 years. A dominant kingdom under David and Solomon, about 1000 BC. Solomon, who built the temple of God upon what we now call the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Later the kingdom was divided, 920 BC. The 10 northern tribes rebelled against the Lord and set up their own alternative religious system. A remnant from the 10 northern tribes joined with Judah and Benjamin to establish the land called Judah, that we call Israel today. 720 BC, the 10 northern tribes are taken into captivity by Assyria. By this time, God has also judged Judah for their rebellion against him. 586 BC, the temple is destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. A third wave of captives are taken, in harmony with Jeremiah's prophecy of a 70-year exile, Jeremiah 29:10. 536 BC, Jews begin to return. King Cyrus of Persia begins to rebuild the temple. 445 BC, there's a third wave of returning exiles, and walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt. However, a significant number of Jews elect to stay in Persia, a territory stretching from Greece to India and south to Egypt. 167 BC, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, defiles the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar, halting temple worship. 3 years later, Judas Maccabeus liberates and cleanses the temple. From this comes the Feast of Hanukkah. Hasmoneans rule Israel until the Roman invasion, which is about 70 AD. And again, the temple is destroyed. 135 AD, because of continued unrest, Jews are barred from Jerusalem for several centuries. The Romans plow over Jerusalem, renaming the city Aelia Capitolina and the land Syria Palestina. All memory of Jewish presence is erased. 1981, the first Jewish immigration into the land of Israel begins, the result of pogroms against them, attacks. 1897, the first Zionist Congress in Switzerland founds the Jewish state. 1914, World War I. The Turkish Ottoman Empire controls the Middle East and outlaws Zionism, expelling 11,000 to 60,000 Jews from Palestine. Losing the war to Great Britain, Jews are permitted back in the land. The land of Transjordan is created as a homeland for displaced Arabs. Today we know it simply as Jordan. In 1933, we had Hitler. He immediately instigates a program of anti-Semitism in accordance with his Mein Kampf, a book he wrote about 10 years earlier. In 1938, representatives of 32 nations meet to discuss the horrific refugee problem created by Hitler's persecution and murder of Jews in Germany and Austria. Britain sides with Germany, and the Jews are barred from immigration into Palestine. 1938 to 1948, upwards of 6 million Jews are murdered by Germany, simply for being Jewish. Great Britain is culpable. 1947, the refugee ship called Exodus is captured by the British in international waters off Palestine. Its cargo, 4,500 Holocaust survivors, are eventually returned to German prison camps by the British. The ensuing media coverage shames the British government, which commits their fate to the United Nations mandate. May 14, 1948, the British mandate ends. At 4 p.m., David Ben-Gurion is recognized as the leader of the Jewish people and declares the existence of the sovereign state of Israel, according to a UN resolution, Resolution 181. May 15, 5 Arab nations attack Israel, and war rages for several months. Jordan captures the eastern part of Jerusalem and Israel's historic heartland, Judea and Samaria. They kill and or expel the Jews in that territory and desecrate the Jewish holy sites. They annex the territory and rename it the West Bank of Jordan. Their sovereignty over that territory is not recognized by any nation other than Britain and Pakistan. Egypt claims the Gaza Strip. 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization is formed by Egypt's President Nasser. They draw up a charter with the goal of liberating Palestine, of Israel, liquidating the Jewish state. June 5, 1967, Israel makes a preemptive strike against Egypt, while Nasser is preparing a war of annihilation with Syria and Jordan. In defending herself, Israel captures the Golan Heights and the Sinai Peninsula, along with the West Bank, which includes the Temple Mount. September 1967, the Arab nations meet in Khartoum, Sudan, for a conference. They conclude there will be no recognition of Israel, no negotiations with Israel, no peace with Israel. Since then, only Egypt and Jordan have made peace treaties with Israel. October 1973, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel again. For you public school educated viewers, this means one nation from the south, one nation from the north, and the strongest two nations in the coalition. This war lasted more than a month, ending in defeat of Egypt and Syria. November 1977, President Sadat makes a historic visit to Jerusalem, signs a peace treaty, handing over the oil-rich Sinai Peninsula to Israel. He is forced to keep the Gaza Strip. He is also assassinated by Muslim extremists 3.5 years later. December 1980, Israel's Knesset, their parliament, makes Jerusalem what they call the eternal and indivisible capital of Israel. 13 countries moved their embassies to Tel Aviv. The next 20 years see tremendous upheaval and destruction as Arab states seek to drive Israel out. July 2000, President Bill Clinton brings Israeli and Palestinian leaders to Camp David for what they call the final status talks. March 2002, more than 100 Israelis are murdered, 30 of which die in a single attack on a Passover Seder. Israel reoccupies most of the territory and cities ceded to the Palestinians. Yasser Arafat is held under virtual house arrest in Ramallah. Here the IDF discovers concrete proof that he has been directly financing and coordinating terrorist attacks against Israel. President Bush declares Arafat the main obstacle to achieving peace in the Middle East. Since then, several new initiatives have been launched by Arab nations, only to be broken by those same nations. Today, in response to upwards of 400 missiles, it's now over 1,500, fired into civilian areas, Israel has responded with the only language Muslims understand: force. Will this flare-up result in war? The answer is no. The pattern is set. Israel will retaliate with a greater force, a greater destruction than the Palestinians have, and they will stop. For now, the world will blame Israel for aggression and for bombing civilian targets. The Palestinians targeted civilians too. Yeah, but Israel has greater firepower and more people died, so it's worse. Muslims always make their point with violence. It's just that Israel has a bigger stick. And apparently that's not fair. Last week, Palestinian Authority Chief Mahmoud Abbas shut down West Bank elections. He did so based on the political reality that Hamas would be able to take over the leadership of the West Bank. Hamas has now seized on this event to ramp up their attack on Israel, positioning itself as the true defender of Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Hamas has done everything it could in recent days to fan the flames of violence in Israeli capital, spreading inflammatory Islamist rhetoric, boosting its influence on the Palestinian street at the expense of Fatah, which it depicts as inept. This has included the rocket assaults on Jerusalem and southern Israel. More than 150 rockets were launched just last Monday night against Israel's IDF. They were able to destroy all of them. According to Walla News, Israel's Security Cabinet has given the IDF permission to hit targets throughout the Gaza Strip. The excuse? the threatened eviction of families from their homes in occupied East Jerusalem by Jewish settlers. The northwest sector of the Old City is claimed by Muslims and is called the Muslim Quarter. South of that is the Jewish Quarter, where the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, stands. West of these quarters is the Dome of the Rock, Islam's holiest site and Israel's holiest site, as it is the place where the Jewish temple stood. During Ramadan, Muslims gather at the Western Wall to pray. North and east along the Mediterranean coast is the city of Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv was the temporary government center of the state of Israel until the government moved to Jerusalem in December of 1949. With tensions rising, and presumably because it is Ramadan, Al-Qassam brigades launched the largest missile strike on Tel Aviv and the areas surrounding it in history. The official statement reads, "Now, in fulfillment of our promise, the Al-Qassam Brigade has launched the largest missile strike on Tel Aviv and its environs with 130 missiles in response to the enemy's targeting of civilian high-rises." What are they talking about? They're referring to an attack by the Israeli Air Force, which launched a massive wave of strikes on Tuesday, sending 80 aircraft to destroy 150 rocket launch pits, most of them in northern Gaza. Why would they do that? Well, according to published reports, 2 female residents of Ashkelon were killed by Palestinian rocket fire on Tuesday after their homes sustained direct hits. The terror factions had fired some 480 rockets at Israel since Monday evening, according to the Israeli Defense Forces. Of that 480, 550 exploded inside Gaza. Why not more? Well, because of Israel's Iron Dome. It's an air defense system. It intercepts and destroys rockets. It killed 200 of them. Anything heading for a populated area gets one of these. Meanwhile, the Israeli Air Force launched a massive wave of strikes on Tuesday, sending 80 aircraft to destroy 150 rocket launch pits, most of them in northern Gaza. Strikes on the tunnels destroyed the firing capabilities of 3 Hamas battalions, which have sustained what they call a significant blow, according to an international IDF spokesman. Some, if not many, of the firing pits used by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad are embedded within the civilian population. When you read of Israeli attacks on civilian targets, that's what they're talking about. Several senior terrorist commanders were also killed in Gaza as part of the IDF's targeting of operatives and their commanders. These included the head of Palestinian Islamic Jihad's rocket unit in Gaza and 3 others in a hideout apartment. The mainstream media only reports that Israeli aircraft target an apartment house. They did not report that Israelis had been given warning to leave the area and that the building housed high-ranking Palestinian military types. The Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff said that it was conducted strikes on over 500 targets just in the last day. This is at least 2 or 3 days old. Determining to strike terror groups in the most serious way possible, extracting a price from Hamas for its action. He also indicated that the IDF was not expecting any slowdown in the fighting in the near future. Israel has also continued to signal that it was not interested in discussing truth proposals. Rather, it is focused on extracting a price from Hamas for its action. Conriquez said, "We've been told to prepare for various scenarios. The liberal media's emphasis seems to be on Israel's rough treatment of Palestinians. But they, the Palestinians, can fire hundreds, almost indiscriminate rockets at densely populated Israeli cities without any mention of the immorality of such a thing. When Israel defends herself, she is the problem." All of this is called war. And war has always been a zero-sum game. No nation, no people group have ever won a war by being fair or being careful. Israel did not start the war, nor any other war. All she did was move back into the neighborhood she established more than 4,700 years ago, doing so at the instruction and help of Almighty God, not to mention the UN. The history of Israel highlights this particular concept. It begins with Abraham and extends through Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses. Once a homeland was established, there were notable kings, David, Solomon, and a host of lesser kings for the next 500 years or so. The first significant Jewish diaspora dispersion was the result of the Babylonian exile of 586 BC. They returned 50 years later under Cyrus. There were other instances, none of which were very great or nor very long. And there were Jews who chose to stay where they were and not return, giving rise to the concept of diaspora. The largest, most significant, and culturally creative Jewish diaspora in early Jewish history flourished in Alexandria in 333 BC, the death of Alexander. It is thought that at that time 40% of the population was Jewish. Around the 1st century AD, an estimated 5 million Jews lived outside of Palestine, 4/5 of them within the Roman Empire, but they looked to Palestine as the center of their religious and cultural life. Diaspora Jews outnumbered Jews in Palestine even before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Thereafter, the chief centers of Jerusalem shifted from country to country: Babylon, Persia, Spain, France, Germany, Poland, Russia, as well as the United States. And Jewish communities gradually adopted distinctive languages, rituals, cultures, some submerging themselves in non-Jewish environments more completely than others. Some lived in peace, others became victims of violence, anti-Semitism. During the Second World War, Germany sought to annihilate the Jews. That effort stimulated the Great Return as Jews sought their ancestral homeland in an effort they called Never Again. Her neighbors are a mixture of family, descendants of Abraham, and the godless mixture of ancient tribes that populated the area God gave them. His descendants having resorted to Egypt as a result of the extended famine. Egypt, a nation being run by the youngest son of Abraham's grandson, Jacob, whose brothers sold him into slavery because they feared their father loved him more than they. It was about inheritance and pride. And it still is. Who's going to win this war? The overarching answer is God. Israel's not going anywhere. The sons of Ishmael, Arabs, Egyptians. Ishmael married an Egyptian woman, had 12 sons, and others. Esau, from whom Jacob stole the birthright, the descendants of the Amalekites, Edomites, were and now are allied against Jacob's sons, the Israelites. All are arrayed against Israel, and yet here she stands. Yet, even, still. God is working his plan. His plan revolves around Israel. Jesus was born a Jew. Jews have held on to their religion for over 4,700 years. But the Bible tells us that during the Great Tribulation, Israel will see a remnant coming to faith in Christ, their Messiah. Jesus returns to earth, and it will be largely due to Israel's impending destruction during a campaign called Armageddon. Here a remnant of Israel will be saved, rescued, become believers in Jesus as their Messiah. Hosea chapter 6 says it clearly, "Come, let us return unto the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal us. He hath smitten, and he will bind us. After 2 days he will revive us, and the 3rd day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight." Hosea chapter 6, "Then shall we know." We follow on to know the Lord. His going forth is prepared as the morning, and he shall come unto us as the rain, as the latter and former rain unto the earth. So keep your eye on Israel. She is surrounded by mortal ancient enemies, and yet she continues to not only survive but prosper. Her enemies are confounded on a regular basis. And even today, she boldly defends herself against all comers. Much of what she has accomplished is nothing short of amazing. So never underestimate her. Even in her spiritual apostasy, she is a formidable foe because she is God's chosen.